And thanks for joining us for this Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. I'm your host, Peter Sled. Our guest this week is former California Republican Congressman Chris Cox. He's written a new book, critical of President Woodrow Wilson, and that podcast begins in a moment. Well, Chris Cox spent 17 years in Congress and 4 as chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He's a Republican. A lawyer by training, he spent the last 14 years of his life researching and writing a biography of Woodrow Wilson, the nation's president from 1913 to 1921. Congressman Cox focuses his biography, published by Simon & Schuster, on 2 areas that intersect: Woodrow Wilson's racist policies and his longtime opposition to universal suffrage. As he writes in his new book, Woodrow Wilson, with his anti-woman and Southern roots, was, quote, superbly unsuited to be president in the era he was elected. Our conversation with Chris Cox about Woodrow Wilson begins now. Chris Cox, why would a longtime Republican congressman spend 14 years researching Woodrow Wilson?
Well, I doubt I would have spent 14 years if I'd known in advance that that's how long the project would take, but one thing led to another. I got started writing about women getting the vote. That was really my original topic, and it was a subject that had interested me for a long time, and particularly why it took so long. Woodrow Wilson ended up factoring into the final act in such a major way that I started looking back at why he had the attitudes that he did, and ultimately telling the story around Woodrow Wilson and around his bio really made sense. Simon & Schuster, who got interested in the book, thought that was the right framework for the story. But 14 years of research was required because, at least for me, I discovered that in order to write a book that's really interesting for the reader, that reads almost like a story or a novel, requires a lot of detail. But you can't say that somebody had a glass of rosé at dinner, or that they were, looking out the window at the storm, or anything like that, the normal kinds of writer's details, without it actually being true. And you have to find it someplace. And beyond that, as you get into the really tough facts of telling a political story, you've got different versions of events. And then you've got to run around who's telling the truth, who's not, maybe this is apocryphal, and so on. So it's just, sometimes I would spend weeks on a single sentence.
So, 14 years, 500 pages, thousands of sources and footnotes. What did you learn?
Oh my gosh, I learned so much. First of all, I had what amounted to a 14-year course in women's studies. I also learned a lot about a lot of people that I didn't know that well. Men, not just women. Men in Congress, and of course, for me, because I have a background in Congress, it was a lot of fun learning more history about the institution where I had spent 17 years. It was fun to learn that people were so courageous and so ahead of their time, at least from our perspective, and just wonderful role models for us in the 21st century. I learned a lot about Woodrow Wilson. And even though this book is focused on his attitudes on race and on women and women voting, which he unfortunately gets low marks in, there are other aspects of Woodrow Wilson, his relationship with his father, his sense of humor, which he hid from most people, those sorts of things that I admired. And so I just learned a lot about people who are at the center of this story.
From your book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, as the first Southern Democrat to occupy the White House since the Civil War era, Woodrow Wilson was superbly unsuited for the moment.
And in particular for the moment when the battle, which had been going on for decades and decades for women getting the vote, had reached a tipping point, because that's when he shows up on the scene. And really, if you think of it like volleyball or basketball, The ball was right there to be slammed, and that's all he would have had to do as a leader of the country at that time, because society had changed so much. This is the 20th century. We've got women in the workplace. We've got technology that makes it possible for home industry to be offloaded to Sears Roebuck and Piggly Wiggly grocery stores and so on. The country was ready for this, and it got delayed for almost the entirety of Wilson's 2 terms.
Can you say definitively after your research that Woodrow Wilson was a misogynist and a segregationist?
Certainly he was a segregationist. He deliberately segregated the federal government. When he was challenged on it, he publicly defended it. There was a study done just 4 years ago by the National Bureau of Economic Research. They went through all of the civil service records from the Wilson administration, and they found out that it was really the entire federal government, not just the Postal Service, not just the Treasury, not just the Navy and so on, but the entire federal civil service was segregated under Woodrow Wilson. So absolutely, he deserves that label. Misogyny, the dictionary definition tilts towards hatred of women, and that doesn't describe Woodrow Wilson. He didn't hate women. But he had very, very traditional Southern Democratic, really, I would say, antebellum attitudes towards women for much of his life. He changed over the course of his political career in his attitudes towards women and whether they could be involved in civic affairs. But he never got over his opposition to black women voting or black men, at least in the South, because he didn't want political control to slip away from the Democrats who depended on Jim Crow, and he was very explicit about that. In private, never in public.
His first teaching job was at Bryn Mawr.
Yes, yeah.
How did that go for him?
Which is almost hilarious when you think about it, because it's the last place he wanted to be. But he hadn't any choice. He had spent a lot of years in school, but had only an undergraduate bachelor's degree to show for it. He started out in college at Davidson in North Carolina, dropped out after a year, not a very successful year, then took a gap year at home with his parents, then went to what was then called the College of New Jersey and repeated his freshman year and stayed there for 4 years. He then attempted, after graduating from the College of New Jersey, law school, not because he wanted to be a lawyer, but because he wanted to be a politician. He knew at that time he thought he wanted to be a senator, U.S. senator, and the way to do that would be to go get a law degree. And so he went to the University of Virginia, which
for a semester, basically.
Really for a year, for an academic year, but then dropped out again because he hated the law and said so. He almost was kicked out of law school for not showing up. He just didn't like it. So, now he's, off doing other things. He's went back home, really didn't have a job of any kind. In fact, he never got even a summer job during his school years, which was unusual for that time, to never have worked for pay. He attempted then to practice law without a law degree, which you didn't have to have in those days, but without apprenticing himself to a lawyer either. So not surprisingly, that didn't work out well. That was in Georgia. He'd moved down to Georgia. And finally, his father helped bail him out because he was losing. So his father and mother were sustaining him down there in Georgia. So they helped him land a spot at Johns Hopkins. And he went to school at Johns Hopkins, dropped out of Johns Hopkins after 18 months. He was trying to get a PhD, but didn't finish it. And so now he needs to get a job, because when he was down there in Georgia, he met his future wife. They were engaged. It was a 2-year engagement because she didn't want to marry him until he had his feet on the ground. And he was dying to get married. So he got a job, but the only one he could get was at Bryn Mawr. Bryn Mawr, a women's college, and he felt about teaching women that it was about as appropriate. He wrote this in private, of course. It was about as appropriate as lecturing to stonemasons on the evolution of fashion, trying to teach women politics or government. He thought that when he spoke to female students that his words passed through a vacuum, and on and on. And at Bryn Mawr, of course, the school had set the bar very high, and so the women that made the entrance exam to this school and then went on, many of them became some of the foremost scholars in the United States, but he didn't appreciate that at the time.
Who was Carrie Thomas?
And Carrie Thomas was the driving force behind Bryn Mawr. She was his boss, and he did not appreciate the dean of Bryn Mawr being a woman at this women's college. These were academic imposters, he thought, people pretending to men's roles. And so he looked at her as someone, notwithstanding that she was academically much more accomplished than he was, who he was trying to evade. She was trying to, help him, actually. She gave him a job, but he didn't appreciate it because of who she was. Her background, remember, he hasn't anything but this undergraduate degree from the College of New Jersey. She had a PhD summa cum laude from the University of Zurich, and her course of study was Indo-Germanic linguistic theory and the evolution of that. For her PhD, she had to be interviewed during oral exams by the leaders of the university in 9 separate disciplines. But she was the first summa, by the way, that anybody could remember. They weren't giving them away. So she was quite the scholar. And she had worked for years, spent a lot of time in libraries writing her PhD dissertation. She had then been at the founding, really, of Bryn Mawr, and she also, at the same time, was starting the Bryn Mawr School, which was going to be a feeder school for young girls who, when they graduated, would be able to meet the entrance exams at Bryn Mawr. So quite a force of nature and quite a feminist. And he'd never met one before, so he was just completely confused about how to deal with her.
Now, most of the professors at Bryn Mawr at that time had PhDs, correct? Did Woodrow Wilson ever get a PhD?
Well, first you're correct that he was the only one without graduate degree or PhD, and the only one who hadn't studied in Europe, because they all trained at the best universities in Europe. He did eventually get a PhD, and this is while he was at Bryn Mawr. Carrie Thomas was constantly reminding him he needed to finish the work on his PhD. He had said to his fiancée at the time, now his wife while he's at Bryn Mawr, Ellen, that he was not going to do any more reading, so he never finished the reading requirements for the PhD, and he was never going to take another exam, and that was that, and he left the university. But a few years later, he got in touch with his mentors, 2 of them, at Johns Hopkins, and it's sort of surprising that this could work, but we have the correspondence, we know what they said to each other, and he said, "I need a degree now." And they were so fond of him, so it's nice to have friends in high places, these 2 professors, that they said, "Don't worry, we'll make it a breeze." They gave him a very brief oral exam, and they said, you will pass it with flying colors. Don't worry about this. And 24 hours later, he had his degree. They gave him credit. He hadn't written a dissertation, of course, for his very first book, which he published contemporaneously with quitting Johns Hopkins. And this book it was a very slender volume, and it had some 50 citations to things like, to periodicals like The Nation. And and no original research, which the university required at the time. So they essentially waived the dissertation requirement, waived the reading requirements, and he skated in with an 18-month PhD.
Chris Cox, after spending 14 years with President Wilson, how do you think you would have enjoyed talking with him?
Oh my gosh, if you read as much in the way of personal and private correspondence, public writings, books, and so on from an individual, any biographer would die and go to heaven to be able to have dinner with that person and find out in the flesh what they're really like. Absolutely.
Do you think he was charming?
I think in a certain way he must have been, because he got an awful lot of people to go along with his program. There's no question that he could be standoffish, that he could be off-putting, arrogant, and many other unpleasant qualities that people who didn't like him pointed out. But it's also true that he got his way, and so he knew something about personal interaction for certain.
The Light Withdrawn, what do you mean by that?
That's the subtitle of the book, and it comes from a poem by mid-19th century abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier, after whom Whittier, California is named. It's not about Woodrow Wilson, of course. He wasn't born until a few years later, but it's about Daniel Webster. Abolitionists nationwide had their hearts broken when, at the end of his career, Daniel Webster seemingly abandoned the cause of abolition because of his own presidential ambitions and joined with Stephen Douglas and others in the Compromise of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850 had at its center the fugitive slave law, which made Northerners complicit in slavery. So the poem is about, what do you do when a politician that you have put on a pedestal breaks your heart? And the poet recommends that we don't respond with anger or rage, but rather sadness and humility, which I thought was sort of an appropriate way to approach Woodrow Wilson, because as we look at him from a distance of more than a century, some humility is required.
From your book, Woodrow Wilson was born in Stanton, Virginia on December 28, 1856. It was a year of Bleeding Kansas and the attack on Charles Sumner in the Capitol. The year that Dred Scott's case was reached in the Supreme Court. The year that pro-slavery Democrat James Buchanan was elected president and Lucy Stone chaired the 7th National Women's Rights Convention in New York City. Rather momentous year.
No question. And key there is the two things that are the big issues that the country is dealing with. This is the 7th National Convention for Women's Rights and women getting the vote.
1856, 7th.
Yeah. And it's also, if not the tipping point, it is the gathering storm for the Civil War and for slavery, which was really the friction that was causing the separation between North and South.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Tommy Woodrow Wilson was 9 years old when the Civil War ended. Are there memories from him of the Civil War?
Well, he claimed later, as an adult, that his first memory was when he heard a passerby, and I think he would have been 4 years old when this took place, outside their house say that Lincoln had been elected president and war was coming, and he said he ran into the house and asked his father what this meant. That may be apocryphal, but he said that was his first memory. He would have been living in Georgia at the time. No question, though, that as a 9-year-old, he would surely have memories of what was going on. His father was an officer in the Confederate Army because he had officer rank, because he was a chaplain, and in the Confederate service, the chaplains were direct appointments of the president. So we have Jefferson Davis directly appointing his father, We have his father turning the churchyard, his father was a minister, turning the churchyard into an internment camp for Union soldiers before they were shipped off to Andersonville prison. We have his father, on the eve of the Civil War, preaching and publishing his sermons about the sanctity of slavery. And the Wilson household had enslaved black servants. So Woodrow Wilson is the last U.S. president to have enslaved people in his own household. So no question that even at that young age, the war and the attitudes of his family and neighbors would have made a big impression on him. Even more influential was the Reconstruction period that followed, because he continued to be a Southerner till he was really 28 years old when he finally changed his domicile. And Reconstruction, which we can talk more about, is something that he wrote about extensively when he was at Princeton.
What was his view of Robert E. Lee?
He idolized Robert E. Lee, another one of those boyhood memories that he spoke about later as an adult. In this case, it was, if memory serves, 1909 in a speech at the University of North Carolina. So this would be late in his presidency of Princeton University. He talked about what Robert E. Lee means to us today, and he thought that Robert E. Lee represented the power of love, and he then sort of elaborated and explained why the Confederate cause was so noble. And he said that even knowing what he then knew in 1909, that more than 500,000 people would be killed, that the Confederate government would collapse, and so on, that if it were up to him, he would decide that we should spend our own blood because it was a matter of conscience and self-respect. So it didn't trouble him at all that the war aims of the Confederacy included near the top, or at the top, protecting slavery. And so if you can set that aside, then perhaps you can find the qualities of love in Robert E. Lee.
I want to go back to 1856 for a minute. In your book, you have a 2-page description of the beating of Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts on the Senate floor. It's very descriptive, it's brutal. I wanted to read it out loud. It's just a little too long, but I would recommend, if you pick up the book, to make sure to spend a little time with that. Why did you include such a graphic description of that, and how long did it take you to write that?
It's only a few pages, as you mentioned, but if you go check the end notes, there are over 50 notes. The caning of Charles Sumner, as it's usually referred to, first came to my attention as a high school sophomore in my American history class. And I remember distinctly what I took away from the picture. I can still see there was a cartoon of the caning of Charles Sumner, and I still see the page of my textbook. And I thought, this is like old people hitting each other with their canes. This is no big deal. What I didn't realize until much, much later, it was before I started writing this book, that I had come across some materials that made it very plain that more was at stake here. Sumner was beaten so badly that he couldn't return to the U.S. Senate for 3 years. And so given Wilson's birth in this year, and given how exemplary this was of the fight and how much everyone hated one another on both sides of this question, I thought this would be a good way to start the story. But going through the congressional record, there were investigations, there were witnesses, and so just a ton of material. And if you go through it sufficiently carefully, you realize, first, how premeditated this was. Second, how insanely brutal it was. Third, it wasn't just one guy, coming in. It was 3 people who had plotted for 2 days exactly how they were going to execute this. And so, I thought it deserved, the full treatment to let you know that this man was nearly killed. He was close to death, and I'm not sure that the man who did it to him could have been sure that he was going to live through it. The one other thing is, what happened to Preston Brooks, the guy who was doing the hammering with a stick as hard as whalebone that he picked out.
Congressman from South
for
Carolina.
the purpose, Congressman from South Carolina. So this is at a time when the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. And naturally, if you beat someone nearly to death on the Senate floor, you'd think there'd be some discipline afterward. When the Senate took it up, in order to, the majority of that body, believed in the cause that the assailant was fighting for, protecting our state's rights to have slavery. So they didn't really want to punish him. So they said, we can't do anything because he's a member of the House, so the House will have to take care of this. And then in the House of Representatives, for essentially the same reasons, they said, well, we can't do anything about this because it took place in the other body, in the Senate. So nothing happens to him in the House. There is a sort of bogus criminal prosecution. The District of Columbia at this time is very pro-slavery. It's a segregated town. So he gets off with a very small fine and walks away. And his constituents in South Carolina, he resigns, as a matter of honor, and they have an instant snap election and reelect him overwhelmingly, and he comes right back. So I think that's just illustrative of how these people, not just the guy who's wielding the stick, but all the members of Congress on his side hated all the members of Congress on the other side, and that's how Americans were feeling about each other at the time. This is the world into which Woodrow Wilson was born.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. What was the debate like over those, the importance of those? And what I learned in your book was that, which I hadn't thought about, the 13th Amendment was passed in Congress while the Civil War was still going on.
Right, in 1865.
Right.
Yeah. So it was possible to pass these amendments in Congress because the southern states had all left the country and formed their own country. So that tipped the balance, obviously, and getting the two-thirds vote necessary to pass a constitutional amendment was much easier. So the Reconstruction Amendments all followed that pattern. During Reconstruction, Tommy Wilson's home state of Georgia, became the very last state in 1870, under the gun, essentially, under military occupation, to ratify the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed black men the right to vote. And so, it didn't go down well in the South. This is part of Reconstruction that Wilson hated because he believed that allowing black people to vote was at the heart of all the problems that the country was facing, and that Republicans were very cynical about doing this. It wasn't a matter of civil rights or nobility or being true to American ideals. It was just for power. And so Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania or Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, these were just party hacks, and that's the way he felt about them and what he wrote about them.
1878, Woodrow Wilson is at the College of New Jersey, Princeton. The first amendment to the Constitution for universal suffrage is introduced in the Congress. Am I getting that right?
Yes, 1868 is when debate began on the 15th Amendment, and in 1868, two men, one of them from Kansas, another one from Indiana, one in the Senate, one in the House, introduced constitutional amendments that squarely said women have the right to vote. One did it on the basis of citizenship, the other used the word sex, which ended up in the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which is now part of the Constitution. 10 years later, in 1878, Aaron Sargent, senator from California, introduced essentially the 15th Amendment word for word, but took out race, color, previous condition of servitude, and substituted sex, and that is now what is our 19th Amendment.
During this time, though, Woodrow Wilson saw the 14th Amendment as radical and revolutionary.
Yes, because the 14th Amendment was the first attempt at extending voting rights to previously enslaved men. And the 15th Amendment came along because the 14th Amendment didn't have any sanction that was effective. So both the 14th and the 15th were objectionable to Woodrow Wilson because fundamentally he believed that he had a lot of very bad things to say about black people as voters. And ignorant black people should not be allowed to vote. And he wasn't saying that other black people should be allowed to vote. It was just, an equation for him, ignorant and black.
So when you look at the suffragist movement and the movement to get rid of Jim Crow, was there conflict between these two groups?
Yes, and leading the conflict was Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were first and foremost, at this time in their lives and careers, worried about women getting the right to vote, and their paradigm was white women such as themselves. So you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton talking about, are we supposed to allow Sambo, to pass through the celestial gates into the privilege of voting before educated white women?
And that's a direct quote?
Yeah, so the Sambo is a direct quote. Frederick Douglass, who was a great supporter and friend of both Anthony and Stanton, and had been all the way back to the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, took her to task for this, and had, a fair amount of support from other women. The result was that because of the argument over the 15th Amendment, giving ultimately black men but not women the right to vote, even though let me just backtrack and say the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment both started out during deliberations, including women. So we have to remember that, when we're talking about Woodrow Wilson showing up in the 20th century, this fight for women's votes had been taking place in Congress, way back in the 1860s, in Congress. And constitutional amendments were considered at that time. So when we get around to the 15th Amendment, this is the second bite at the apple. The 14th Amendment was the first. The co-chair of the drafting committee for the 14th Amendment, Thaddeus Stevens, insisted that they use sex-neutral language, and he went to the floor and said, I will never have the words white or male ever put in the Constitution. So that was the nature of the debate back then. For the 14th Amendment, women lost on that one. Stanton and Anthony were really unhappy when they lost again on the 15th Amendment. And so that's why this rage, and that's why it provoked a split in the women's suffrage movement. And you end up with two groups. You have the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, and that went on for a generation.
And that at some point became the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA.
Right. So when you put together the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, you can imagine the discussion they must have had. So if you mush those two names together, you end up with something unpronounceable, really, National American Women's Suffrage Association. So henceforth, it was always called NAWSA.
Chris Cox, are dates important when you're writing about history?
They are. As a writer, I didn't want it to look like a textbook. And you also want people to realize how much like the present this is. These are real people, this is all happening, and I didn't want to carbon date it. But it's very difficult for the reader if there are no dates, because then you don't have a place to hang your hat. So you need some signposts along the way. And I think there's a little bit of art and how much of that to sprinkle in, but you never want to leave the reader wondering, where are we?
Was it easy to go down rabbit holes in your research?
Yeah, I mean, rabbit holes are not the only thing that took me away from making rapid progress. I think I mentioned earlier, it's slow to write nonfiction because there are so many things that may or may not be exactly what they appear to be. But yes, I mean, to your question, it's a rabbit hole, I think, if it's something that's just so damn interesting that you keep pulling on that thread, even though you realize it's taking you further and further away from your story. Sometimes, though, that kind of research results in serendipity. And you say, holy cow, who knew? So, much later in the story, just to use an example, when Alice Paul, a 20th century suffrage leader, is in Wilson's crosshairs, he decides to have the Secret Service surveil his enemies, including Alice Paul and including the suffragists. And this is all, the Secret Service is part of the Treasury. One of the officers who reports to the Secretary of the Treasury, who reports to Wilson on this surveillance of Alice Paul, is her former graduate school professor. And I found this from going through her report cards, and it's the same guy. I put it in a footnote. It doesn't really change the arc of the story, but just things like that are just so amazing. You've got her former teacher is now her spy master.
Where's the bulk of the Woodrow Wilson papers?
The bulk of them are at the Library of Congress. The papers of Woodrow Wilson, compiled by Arthur Link, were done under the auspices of Princeton University, and that's 69 volumes in hard copy.
How many of them did you read?
Well, it's several 100,000 documents. And I think you're not going to believe me when I say most of them, but it's true because the collection wasn't digitized until about 7 years ago, and I was already halfway into my research. So for the first half, I was using the physical volumes, and the only way to find what you're looking for is to turn those pages.
Well, I should say at this point that I worked for Chris Cox for a couple of years in the early 90s, and so I do believe that you read all hundreds of thousands of pages of those documents. Did you start your research after being chairman of the SEC, which
Yes.
you left in 2009?
Yes, I didn't begin this until I was, fairly far along in my after government career as a lawyer, and so the first drafts that I produced were 2010, and I left the government at the beginning of 2009. I left Congress 2005.
After 2009, what was your career?
So I joined a law firm, Bingham McCutcheon, which was an international law firm based in Boston. They merged with another very well-known international law firm, Morgan Lewis, a few years later. And so I had been a partner at Bingham, and then I became a partner at Morgan Lewis. Both firms also had a global consulting firm. And a few years after joining Bingham, I became president of that consulting firm as well, and then also president of Morgan Lewis Consulting. That I did until 2020, and then I retired from law practice. Since that time, I've been on some boards and writing.
And are we allowed to mention that you're part owner of a women's WNBA team?
Yeah, an expansion team in Portland, and also a women's soccer team, the Thorns in Portland. So I get to work with my old legislative partner Ron Wyden from Oregon, because he's a former Division I college basketball player himself.
You and Ron Wyden are known for Section 230 of the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
And also the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which he and I wrote together.
What is Section 230, and should it stay as it is?
So Section 230 is about the rules of liability for publication on the internet, on any website, not just social media, but any kind of website. And because social media has morphed into what it is today, where so many people are involved with it and so on, I think everybody's very familiar with that aspect. When you write something and post it on a social media site, you as the author of that are fully responsible legally for what it says. People expect that their posts will go up in real time, that there can be millions or billions of posters, and so on. And given that volume and given that time frame, what can we expect of people who are hosting that content at no charge to the folks who are creating it? Those were the questions that Congress considered when what's now known as Section 230, became law back in the 90s. It's different than publishing a newspaper, or different than having a TV news broadcast, because the editors of a newspaper get to read what they're publishing beforehand. Not generally possible with electronic media, but obviously letting it all come through comes at a cost. So in Section 230, what Congress also tried to do, and I should mention that this was deliberated for over a year in the House and the Senate, and eventually passed overwhelmingly in both chambers. What they decided is that we should make it possible for people hosting this content to themselves exercise what we now think of as content moderation, but to try and keep all the bad stuff off the internet, and that they should be treated as good Samaritans when they do that. The internet's changed a lot since the 1990s. We now know a lot of the really bad things that can happen, as well as the really good things that can happen. So, if I were in Congress, I'd probably want to tinker with it, because court decisions have changed it over the last several decades. But I also worry about tinkering with it when I'm not there, because once you open that can of worms and you get all these committees working on it and so on, we could lose a lot of free speech rights if we do it wrong.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Chairman of the SEC from 2005 to 2009, I believe.
Yeah.
How did Bernie Madoff slip through the cracks for so many years?
Yeah, this is like the great spy scandals at the CIA and so on, where how did this happen? Madoff came to my attention and to the attention of the commission at the SEC literally just weeks before the end of my term. So I wasn't around for all the prosecution and so on, but they had turned themselves in. I mean, that's how the SEC found out about it. Meantime, Bernie Madoff, throughout the 1990s, was an eminence. He was the head of the NASD, and he had been invited by previous chairman of the SEC to come and speak at roundtables as an expert and so on. And so he was hiding in plain sight, and nobody apparently put the pieces together as they certainly should have.
Back to your book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. Quote, "The tone at the top throughout Wilson's stewardship as president of Princeton University remained decidedly racist. He was known on campus for his racial jokes and his exaggerated imitation of black dialect.
Yeah, all true. And he continued to do that as a candidate. So when he ran for governor, his stump speeches would include black dialect jokes.
He resigned in 1910 as president of Princeton, elected president in 1912. How did that happen?
Well, he didn't resign until after he'd been elected governor. So he
of New Jersey, and he served that for what? Less than almost 2 years?
Half a term, yeah. So really meteoric rise. He was doubly lucky, I'll say, fortunate, because first, when he ran in 1910 for governor, it was at the invitation of the party bosses in New Jersey who'd been out of luck themselves. Republicans had a string of victories, and the Democrats were looking for a candidate who was not besmirched by scandal, which politics, being especially corrupt at that time, was really bedeviled with. And so here's this academic who had made a name for himself because of the books that he published for popular audiences. Wilson's books were aimed at popular audiences. They had illustrations and so on. People maybe bought them for what we would think of as coffee table books, but they bought them. And he wasn't writing for his fellow academics, so he was well known, and he was also speaking around the country and so on. And he had promoters, including his book publisher at Harper and Brothers, who wanted him to be president. And so the head of Harper and Brothers at the Lotus Club in New York, 4 years before Wilson actually ran, announced that he's going to be president of the United States. And then in Harper's Weekly, put a banner up in every issue saying Woodrow Wilson for president. So he's got all of this going for him, and the party bosses loved the fact that because he had never taken a position in politics, in elective politics before, he could adopt the right position du jour on every subject. And so Wilson did a quick change from bourbon Democrat to progressive because that was the prevalent flavor at the time. He had been against labor unions, which he said were causing everybody to not work very much, to do as little as possible. He didn't like initiative and referendum. He didn't like direct election of senators. But all of that he put aside to become the perfect progressive. And then he stayed a progressive and really was known for that later. But that's what he was able to do in 1910. 1910 turned out to be a Democratic year also because of the tariff, interestingly. The Payne-Aldrich tariff, really unpopular across the country. Democrats all voted against it. Wilson had, because he was a Southerner, and Southerners never had liked tariffs. That was for Northern manufacturers. So Wilson had an easy time of picking on Republicans in Washington while he's running for governor. Democratic year, and he becomes governor. Then he's doubly fortunate because when he gets the Democratic nomination, it's because he's both Northerner and Southerner at the same time. The Southerners all saw him as one of them. Remember, he's born in Virginia, raised in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Northerners knew him because he's president of Princeton, right nearby from New York. Tammany knew him and so on. Didn't think of him as a Tammany guy, but not so bad. And so he was the compromise candidate when, under the Democratic Party rules, they needed to get a 2/3 vote. The 2/3 rule had gone back to slavery days, and it was meant to give the South a veto, and they were able to essentially exercise that veto to get their guy, Woodrow Wilson. His last bit of serendipity is that in the general election, he gets to run against not one but two Republican presidents because, as is famously known, Teddy Roosevelt almost got the Republican nomination at the convention in Chicago, but then bolts the party, and they're both on the ballot, he and Taft.
And Woodrow Wilson got like 435 electoral votes, but only 41% of the
42%,
popular.
42% of the popular vote brings him to the White House. So, lucky man.
And in 1916, in re-election, Charles Evans Hughes almost beat him.
Yes, in fact, everybody on the East Coast went to bed, certain that Hughes had won the election. In Times Square, they put the lights all on to indicate that Hughes had won. The Times was for Wilson, but they announced that Hughes had won. But what happened is that out in California, where the war was the big issue in 1916, women voters in this Republican state, California was then Republican, broke with the party to vote for the peace candidate. And Wilson had run as the peace candidate. He kept us out of war was their slogan in that year. The balloting was so close in California that they hand counted ballots all week long, and then on Friday it was determined that Hughes had lost by 3,421 votes.
Didn't Alice Paul have her own slogan about Woodrow Wilson? She was a Hughes supporter, but he kept us out of suffrage.
Yes, exactly. She turned that on its head.
Were suffrage, segregation, big issues in the 12 and 16 campaigns?
Yes. Teddy Roosevelt turned out to be the more formidable of the two presidents who Wilson found as his opponents. And Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 was really banging the drum for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So Wilson had to deal with this, and he didn't want to talk about it. But the country was very much interested in talking about it. States had already begun granting women the right to vote by state action. California in 1911, for example, gave women the right to vote. So you have states with a not insignificant amount of electoral votes, certainly in a close election enough to worry about, where women are already voting, and what does Wilson have to say about this? And so he got confronted during the election when women would stand up and say, what about this? And he would say, I'm not going to talk about it. It's not a national issue, just for the states. Now, he had just been governor of New Jersey, and so if this is an issue for the states, what was his view there? Well, his view, as he explained it to the press, was he's positively against women voting. So he didn't express it that way once he became president. He said, well, that's for the states. But he hadn't changed his view. Then fast forward to 1916, and now it's really a big issue. I mean, women are really, really banging at the door, and a lot of men are happy to support them. There are women's leagues men's leagues for women's suffrage, prominent in New York, but also in other parts of the country. And a lot of elected officials are out front on this, and Wilson is just still trying to hang back, and so he takes the view that we're going to do this by state action. Then in 1916, right before the election, we find out what's really going on. And this is totally by accident, but he has a meeting with 4 Democratic women, one of whom is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter. And he believes that he's talking to friendly Democratic women and he's going to explain to them the politics of women's suffrage. But here's Harriet Stanton Blatch, and she asks him point blank, will you support the Anthony Amendment? He says, no, I will not. And then, according to Blatch, Wilson exploded the idea that it was states' rights that was the real reason, even though he'd been using this reason for years. He said, Mrs. Blatch, the real reason that neither I nor the Democratic Party will support the Susan B. Anthony Amendment is because of the black vote. And then she pushed back, and she took him on his terms and said, all right, if black women vote and black men are already voting, it won't change anything proportionally. There's more white women to start with. And he said, no, you're wrong about that. In South Carolina and Mississippi, black voters have 55%, black citizens would represent 55% of the population. So he's really focused on making Jim Crow stick, and he doesn't like the Anthony Amendment because Section 2 of it brings federal enforcement and now we're going to be back to the period of Reconstruction that he so hated.
Chris Cox, were suffragism and Jim Crow front page issues like the war was at this time?
Yes, and they were in large measure because of the work of the National Women's Party. Before that it was called the Congressional Union, led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. These women were really impressive people. And their challenge after the World War started was to keep women's suffrage, which had already reached this tipping point, but to keep it front page news against the slaughter of millions of people around the world. That was no easy task, but they managed to do it, and that made, at the time, women's getting the right to vote the biggest domestic issue, particularly after Prohibition passed. Women's getting the right to vote and the war itself were the two big issues.
Well, unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. We haven't been able to talk about Jeanette Rankin and Mary Peck, but I did want to ask about Woodrow Wilson's friend, Thomas Dixon.
Thomas Dixon is connective tissue throughout Woodrow Wilson's academic and political career. They were classmates at Johns Hopkins. Dixon had, this is now graduate school, Johns Hopkins. Dixon had graduated from Wake Forest with the highest honors ever in the history of that school. He had a theatrical bent. He had written a play by the time that he was in school with Wilson sitting next to him in class. The play was from college to prison, and it was the very sympathetic tale of a guy who was arrested for being in the Ku Klux Klan. He then became a novelist. He had a number of careers. Was a lawyer for a while, got elected to his state legislature for a while, moved to New York and was writing books that sold millions of copies. And he wrote a trilogy of books that were about the Ku Klux Klan, the most famous of which is The Klansman. The Klansman became a stage play in 1910 when Wilson's running for governor over in New York at the Liberty Theater. The stage version of The Klansman is being protested by black leaders like William Monroe Trotter and so on because it's so racist. The movie version of it, so now you've got a million-selling book called The Klansman, you've got the stage play, and then you've got the movie version. And the movie version is previewed at the White House because Dixon calls in a favor. And Wilson takes the view after there's pushback because this movie is so racist that he didn't know what it was about. But in fact, he and Thomas Dixon were well aware of each other, had corresponded throughout the years, and even after the screening at the White House, Dixon was advising him on, what to do with the war. When he first got elected, he was advising him on cabinet appointments and so on. So they were much closer than Wilson's hagiographers had wanted us to know.
And The Klansman became the movie Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation, yeah, that was the movie version.
We are out of time, but I do want to ask you about the photographs in this book, and they are really distinctive.
Yeah.
How'd you get that?
I loved doing this. The inspiration for it was another book that Simon & Schuster was the distributor for called The Color of Time. The idea was we take old photographs and painstakingly research what's in the photograph, make sure all the details are correct. Don't use algorithms or AI, but by hand, restore these photos and turn them into living color and make them look like people that are alive now. The Color of Time is a brilliant book, and I recommend it to anybody that's watching this. So I mentioned to Simon & Schuster, this might be something we could do for the Wilson book, and they agreed, and we engaged a European artist named Jacinci, digital artist, who specializes in this. I think he's one of the best in the world. For 2 years, he and I worked together. I'd do the research, finding out, for example, that William Monroe Trotter's eyes are blue. Who knew? But you got to get it right. And even the furnishings, we got pictures from museums of similar kind of furniture to make sure all the details are right, and the rugs and so on. So those are all in color in the book, and even more so in the dedicated website for the book, which is lightwithdrawn.com. If you go online, you can blow them up on your screen, and you can look into Alice Paul's eyes. These people all of a sudden look like, hey, this could have been my next door neighbor, or this is somebody that I might have run into on the street. They look like real people instead of these gray images.
The book is Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. The author, Chris Cox. Thanks for being with us.
Wonderful to be with you.
And thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. If you like this podcast, tell your friends, rate and review us, and follow us on social media. @BookTV is our handle for more updates and schedule information. And are you looking for more of C-SPAN's book programming? Follow our Bookshelf podcast feed, your one-stop source for the Afterwards, Book Notes Plus, and Q&A podcasts. Discover compelling conversations with authors, historians, and thought leaders all in one place. Subscribe to C-SPAN's Bookshelf podcast today. Next week, our guest is travel writer Rick Steves, well known for his European and world tours, who writes about his 1978 adventure as a college student from Istanbul to Nepal in his book, On the Hippie Trail. That's next week on the Q&A podcast.